Hello and welcome to our roundtable discussion on race and religion inside the United States. I'm your host, Owen Morrissey, and let's get started. Over the past year, there have been numerous acts of violence committed in the name of the Islamic State. These crimes were immediately classified as terrorism by law enforcement. Yet, acts of violence committed in the name of Christianity, including massacre at a Planned Parenthood clinic, were not classified as terrorism immediately. Does race and religion play a role in how crimes are classified?
I think that they sort of do, but in this specific case of the Planned Parenthood clinic, so one of the biggest defining factors of determining whether a crime is an act of terrorism is whether or not it is used to scare people and to score political gains. So in this case, when the guy went in and he shot up the Planned Parenthood clinic, they weren't sure if he was crazy or whether he was doing it for Christianity. So in this case, they had to find out more details about it before they were able to classify it as terrorism. So that's my idea.
Well, you know, he did say that he was doing it so more babies couldn't be killed. And that definitely is a political motive. He's obviously anti-abortion.
Yeah, but anti-abortion doesn't necessarily mean Christian.
Well, no, but what I'm saying is that terrorism doesn't have to be religious in nature. It can be, you know, just any sort of politics in general. But I think, you know, if you look in the dictionary, it will say that terrorism is an act of violence committed against non-combatants for a political means. But I think the term terrorism in the U.S. media has sort of become Orwellian in the sense that it doesn't have any meaning, and it's employed basically to mean any violent act committed by a Muslim against a non-Muslim. If you want an example of this, let's take the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's violence on both sides, against both sides, and yet if you take a look at any major newspaper, they're not going to call the Israelis terrorists as well. They're going to call the Palestinians terrorists.
Well, we don't really have Israeli terrorists like we have Palestinian terrorists. You don't have Israelis going across the border and stabbing up Palestinians just about every day, okay? Yes, Palestinians going into Israel and stabbing a bunch of Israelis, okay? You have like terrorist organizations like Hezbollah that are a part of the Palestinian side, actual terrorist organizations. And Israel is a country that has really hostile nations all around. No, so I don't think there's a moral equivalency between Israel and the Palestinians.
I'd agree with all that, except for the fact that Israel does go into the West Bank and Gaza and demolishes people's houses.
Well, that's because there's terrorists there.
Well, no, it's because they're building settlements for Israel. And this is an act that's been denounced by nearly every country except the United States.
Yeah, but the problem is that Israel needs these settlements because the last time they gave a large section of land away to the Palestinians, they responded with terrorist attacks. Okay,
well,
so things
let's get back to the question, which was, I definitely think that religion plays a role in how crimes are classified. If you take a look at the Boston Marathon bombing, the younger brother, Jokar, his Muslim convictions were a lot less intense than his brothers, and yet he was portrayed as a terrorist almost instantly like that. And then if you take a look at the church shooter in South Carolina who shot black people at a church, instantly images surfaced with him and the Confederate flag, and it became clear that this was a political act, a racist act, but a political act. And yet the mainstream media didn't immediately classify it as terrorism, whereas the Tsarnaev brothers were immediately classified as terrorists.
I do agree with Owen on that idea that I think it's probably because with all the history we've had with extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, whenever we see a Muslim that goes into some random place and they with a suicide bomb or shoots up some restaurant, we immediately identify it as terrorism because of just the history that we have. And also, I guess, we've also sort of identified that the goal of ISIS is to sort of force their extremist take on the religion onto others. So,
Right.
and we instantly associate all Muslims that do that with groups like ISIS, and then if you connect the dots like that, then everything they do is instantly terrorism.
Well, I want to
in that
mention
case.
that you have to remember that people up high, like the Obama administration, they've been dragging their feet and even saying the term radical Islamic terrorism. I don't think Obama even says it. So look at the San Bernardino
He
attack.
doesn't, you're right.
Yeah, look at the San Bernardino attack. In the San Bernardino attack, he tried to cast it as a place of, an example of workplace violence, okay? So I don't think there's some major discrimination against Muslims, okay?
Well,
and he tried to, and also, when he won't say radical Islamic terrorism, but he'll tell Christians not to get on their high horse and condemning ISIS, that shows, I think he has some more bias against Christianity than Islam.
Okay, well, first of all, Obama is a Christian. And
Well, he's not very, I don't think he's a very religious Christian. And he
okay,
was
that's
raised by Muslims.
Right,
He went to a
but-
Muslim school.
Right. The reason why Obama doesn't classify those things as radical Islam is because he's afraid
but
he's
you're-
afraid of the nationalistic, Islamophobic passion that gets incited by
No,
that.
but the thing is that
And-
you're saying that there's a problem of classifying Islamic terrorism as Islamic terrorism, even if you don't know everything, not classifying Christian terrorism.
I'm
as
saying
Christian
there's a
terrorism.
problem with
Though
classifying
There's
one-
obviously Islamic terrorism, and the Obama administration, our government, won't even call it Islamic terrorism. So I think that most people are very sensitive towards this, okay? And I think that there is a problem in Islam with jihad, okay?
There definitely is,
Yeah.
but I have a problem. I have a problem with the media instantly classifying any act of violence committed by Muslims towards non-Muslims as terrorism.
Well-
Meanwhile, any act of violence committed by Christians against anybody isn't immediately classified as terrorism, even if it is shown that their motivations were religious in nature.
Well, like Dimitri said, with the Planned Parenthood case, tragic case, and other things like that, it's not, you can't call it terrorism right away. Like, you don't necessarily know if he's a real Christian or something like that. And also, I think a lot of people in the mainstream media kind of want to get after Christianity and say, and I'm actually quite happy to call something Christian terrorism. Like, a lot of people assume the Planned Parenthood situation was Christian terrorism right away, even before the situation was
But
over.
in the New York Times, I remember reading, in various articles, they would mention at the end, they would mention that it's still being debated whether this is terrorism or not.
Yeah.
In the end of the article.
If there's debate going on, that's fine.
But there's no debate going on about whether the Boston Marathon bombing, the younger brother was committing terrorism.
That was
even
obviously
though,
terrorism.
okay, no.
He's bombing
Yes.
a big American staple of
Yeah.
It's a big Boston race, okay? It's a very, very important
But
part of Boston, okay?
is it
It's a big political statement. You defined it as trying to go after some sort of political goal, terrorism.
Or political or
so
religious
there's
goal, yeah.
definitely political motivation at the very
well,
least.
there's political and religious motivation from the older brother, but the younger brother, there's been some speculation to say that he was sort of influenced by his older brother and sort of fell under his spell almost.
But it's perfectly fine
So
to
that's-
call the marathon bombings Islamic terrorism when one of the two people.
But then you also have to
what's a
call-
radical
you have
Islamic,
to-
and if he's the mastermind, then I think that is really, if he's pushing radical Islamic ideology on his brother, it's still radical Islamic ideology.
Well, I know, but when that happens in the to someone who's white, it's seen as, oh, he's disaffected, oh, he's disillusioned with society, oh, he's been isolated.
Well-
It's not a blame on the individual. It's not a
Well-
characterization of the individual. It's, oh, society needs to change.
Well, look at the brothers in the Boston bombing attack. They were pretty normal. I think the younger one, he went to college. A lot of people were extremely surprised that
Exactly.
he did this.
They're-
And look at the Planned Parenthood shooter. He lived in a trailer in the middle of nowhere. He says he's a devout Christian, but lived really sinfully. He beat a woman. He did get into he had children out of his relationship. Okay, and he looked a little bit like Santa Claus. He's kind of he was definitely he seems a lot more mentally ill than someone who carried out the Boston bombing attack or San
you
Bernardino.
don't think that they were mentally ill?
Oh, I think they're mentally ill, but I think that it's more. I think that you can definitely make the case for disillusionment with the Planned Parenthood shooter more so than you can with the Boston bombers or San Bernardino. I think there's definitely more than disillusionment in play in those cases. Later too.
We're going to move on to the next question. U.S. drug policy for the past 30 to 40 years has been dominated by harsh measures such as minimum sentencing laws and broken windows policing. This so-called war on drugs has been waged primarily in minority neighborhoods. Recently, however, drug policy has softened, placing more emphasis on rehabilitation rather than enforcement. Does the shift have anything to do with the opioid epidemic that is ravaging white communities? In other words, has U.S. drug policy softened because the white community, now more than ever, faces the grip of opioids?
Can I go first on this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
So I think that's not the case. I think people are saying explicitly in denouncing the war on drugs that they're saying it's racist against minorities. I think a lot of leaders from these minority neighborhoods oppose it. So I don't think it's white politicians trying to keep other white people from going to jail. I think it's people who are concerned about minorities that are being put in jail on the war of drugs. Doesn't necessarily mean discriminates against minorities.
Well,
and
right.
Well, I would say like, it doesn't necessarily go after minorities just because they're minorities. It doesn't necessarily mean that. But I'd say when people denounce the war on drugs, they do try to paint it as a racist thing, even if it's not actually.
Well,
so I won't say
okay,
just
so-
white people looking out for other white people.
So Nixon was the president who sort of initiated the war on drugs, correct? And I have a
Well,
quote here.
Clinton administration too.
But before that,
But Bill Clinton was a big player in it.
Bill Clinton was a big player.
Advancing
Sure.
police force. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But Nixon was the one who sort of brought it about.
Yeah.
And I have a quote from a Nixon aide. It says, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." That's John Ehrlichman, assistant to President Nixon on domestic affairs, talking about the war on drugs and why the Nixon administration sort of brought it about. From the beginning, this has been a racist policy. This has been about disenfranchising minorities. It's basically the successor to Jim Crow.
Well, Richard Nixon's purpose in it definitely could have been racist, and given that quote, I'd say it was. But then you have to say Bill Clinton's a racist too,
Well,
and advancing
I'm not
the war on
saying
drugs.
that.
Okay, you think Bill Clinton's a racist? That he holds animosity against minorities.
I'm saying that
That's why he increased
saying-
police force. I
No,
think
no.
didn't he have bipartisan support? In
he did have
increasing
bipartisan
police
support,
force?
but that doesn't mean that
With
they were
minority
right in what
minority
they were doing.
politicians. What?
Oh, listen. So my point was that the drug war was at its roots a racist policy designed to
Yeah, at its
disenfranchise.
roots, but it could have been improved. And also, I think in practice nowadays, when we look back on it, it's not necessarily racist. It could do bad things for minority communities, but I think as a whole, it's just that more drug deals and stuff did happen in these like poor communities that happen to be minority communities.
But so great, right? But that's starting to happen now in white communities. More and more whites are being are taking opiates, and they're becoming addicts, and that sort of behavior is becoming more and more prominent in the white community. And all of a sudden, we see a shift in drug policy in the United States where it's been more about recovery rather than punishment. And when this was happening in the black community, when the black community was being ravaged by the drug epidemic, everyone was talking about punishment.
I think that I agree with what Owen's saying. I think that one of the causes of that could be like the socioeconomic status of minorities versus whites. So, for example, like obviously in America, white people are generally better off. So I think that not only are they're better equipped to get their message out and like haggle government authorities and stuff like that, but also in this world, money is power. So if you have more money, people are more likely to listen to you. So people are more likely to listen to the middle class man making $100,000 a year rather than for example, the Hispanic person living in a rundown town who's
Right.
just sitting on the side of the street. So I think that once this started affecting white people, they were obviously able to
Well,
respond in a way that was able to get them help, and they, I guess, their situation allows it, and their knowledge allows it to do it to a better extent than the lower class minorities.
No, do you want to say something?
Yeah, you can say something. I'll say.
Well, so
Sorry
you
for
mentioned
that,
money, and I just like to point out that this the drug war has been a boon for private prison companies. In the United States, 1 out of every 6 federal prisons is a for-profit institution, and this is bad for many reasons. One of them being that the state of Florida found that some private prisons cut their healthcare services by up to 50%. From public prisons, not public prisons, but prisons run by the government. And the Corrections Corporation of America spent over $14 million in lobbying from 2003 to 2010. They were working with groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a conservative advocacy group, which backs legislation like mandatory minimums for drug sentencing and other harsh drug laws. So you can see that there's a clear connection between the private prison companies and the drug war,
Well,
how they're sort of fueling the drug war, trying to criminalize it
Well,
so
now
they can make
this
more
is getting
profit.
kind of theoretical now. Now we're kind of.
This isn't getting theoretical. I have the numbers right here. 2003 to 2010, $14 million were spent on lobbying. This is according to MSNBC.
The drug war was around for a while. Is in the
drug war-
is
Right,
Like,
it was-
according to your
it was-
information. It started in the '60s. Is escalated in the '90s.
It started
under
in the
Clinton
70s.
administration.
It started in the 70s,
Okay.
late 60s, and actually the private prison industry sort of emerged in the 80s. So I'm not saying that
Well,
private
I think because more people have to be going to jail as a result of this policy, which is why people are opposing it now. And when people oppose it, I think the people who oppose these laws the most nowadays are liberal politicians that would agree, that maybe would say, that would probably say it's racist, okay? That would probably agree with you, okay?
Right.
So I don't think they're opposing it because white people happen to have more of a drug problem nowadays, okay? I
Well,
think they're opposing it
I
because
think
they
the
kind of
shift that
because
we've
they agree
seen,
with you whether or not it's right.
the shift that we've seen in drug policy, I think, has stemmed from the fact that all of a sudden this isn't just a minority problem, this isn't just a black problem, this is a problem that affects white people as well. And I think that's why we're seeing the shift. And I do grant you that younger people are sort of look at the drug war and they're like, what is this? Like, I don't understand this. This is, clearly a racist thing. But I think that, old-time politicians are going to look at this as differently through the lens of race.
Yeah, I really think one of the reasons that it could have shifted is that, so as Owen said, when it shifted to white people, the problem shifted to white people, the federal government started to soften on they started to focus more on rehabilitation. And I
Right.
think that, so when you see someone who's poor using opioids, people might say, oh, he's poor, he has nothing better to do with his life. Or you say, like, maybe this guy didn't study in school, or he did it to himself. And then when you see a white person
Right.
who's rich and successful, or like
Middle
there are
class
people,
family,
yeah, middle
right.
class family,
It's
and
more of a
it
problem
comes out
with
of it comes
society.
out of nowhere,
Yeah.
and you're like, oh, she seems so happy. This person had a job, had a lot of friends, and then she just died of overdose. People are like, all right, this clearly isn't that. This is clearly a problem that just doesn't come from being poor. And I think once people saw that, they sort of they start to focus more on like the emotional side about why it's not just you're being poor or being rich. There's clearly something deeper than that that's causing people to use the drugs. And I think that's why they're investing more in rehabilitation.
So you think it's more has more to do with economic status than race?
Well, he's saying that it's more of like a problem with how society.
How society looks at
it's more of a
both.
problem with society when a middle class person, middle class teenager falls under the influence of drugs. It's more of a problem with society. But when it's, a black teenager who's grown up in the ghetto, it's more of a problem with that person. And we've seen this outlined by the way that the drug war has progressed, meaning it's gotten more lenient as more white people are addicted to drugs.
Or I think a lot of it has to do with kind of the time period, like how this has progressed over time, okay? So I think also a way to kind of explain how the drug war is dying down is that people are seeing the drugs expand and they just don't think it's working, so they want to try something else. It doesn't necessarily mean they're motivated by race or economic status. They could just be looking at the law the way it is. And some people would say the drug war worked. I think some people would say it didn't work. Doesn't necessarily mean either one is right. But I would say that it's not necessarily a matter of race or economic status. It could be a matter of like how effective the law was, and changing legislation. Having dynamic legislation. So if you see a problem with it, you can change it down later the line. Doesn't necessarily mean racism or classism, perhaps.
All right, let's move on to the next question. How important is the Black Lives Matter movement? Do you think their tactics, particularly in Ferguson and Baltimore, have been effective?
I don't think the Black Lives Matter movement has done much good. To be totally honest here, okay. So I think that we do have some problems with violence against black people in this country. Okay, that's true, and I think that's worth looking into. And there have been some cases of police misconduct towards African Americans. Okay, the thing is that that's very, very rare. And in these cases, Black Lives Matter has gone after, like Ferguson, the police officer was totally cleared. Baltimore, I think the police officer facing the highest charges was actually an African American, okay? So trying to paint all these as an example of racism is not really honest. And you should think of the tactics they use. A lot of these protesters come from low-income neighborhoods, and they riot, and they destroy businesses in African American neighborhoods, which hurts a lot of African Americans. And also, you have to think of the rhetoric. A lot of the rhetoric's anti-cop. Like you may have seen that video with marchers saying, like pigs in the blanket, fighting like bacon, in reference to cops. A lot of these, so I think that a lot of this is unhealthy. I think it's fine to have a good discussion on race, though I think we have to pay attention to facts and what actually happened.
I agree that rioting and violence is unhealthy. But what's been interesting is to see the reaction from the white side of the country, particularly at Donald Trump rallies. Donald Trump, at one of his rallies, called for the roughing up of a Black Lives Matter movement.
Well,
protest.
I think he just doesn't like any protesters, depending.
That may be, but
I mean, I will admit it's wrong to say you should rough up protesters, but these protesters are being sent by groups to these rallies.
They are,
and they are being disruptful.
Yeah,
but But I don't think it's necessarily that because it's a Black Lives Matter protester. I think like Donald Trump just, he's Donald Trump. He does not like protesters in general.
Well, but his supporters, I think more importantly than that, his supporters are sort of going after these people with physical violence. We've seen video surface of Trump supporters punching black protesters in the face. And I think that this is sort of reminiscent of
we had a video of a black Trump supporter punching a white protester.
Yeah, no, but what I'm saying is that I think that there's been a reaction on the lower class white side where we've sort of seen a competition between these two groups to win politicians' approval, and obviously they've won. The white protester, the white lower class movement has won Donald Trump's support, and I think that it's scary and at the same time interesting to see the brown shirting that's happening at some of these events, meaning that we have like two political factions literally clashing together in physical violence. This is something that's reminiscent of the Weimar Republic and Hitler's rise. This is pretty scary stuff.
Well, I wouldn't compare Trump to Hitler. I mean,
well, I'm not saying
I'm not a big fan of Trump or his ideology, or at least Trump's ideology in general either. But I wouldn't compare him to Hitler, though.
Well, I'm not going to either. But I think that the tactics displayed by some of the supporters of Trump have been reminiscent of Nazi brown shirts in the 30s. So the other thing I think is that the Black Lives Matter movement has been effective on the Democratic side, not on the Republican side at all. The Democratic presidential campaigns have sort of extended an olive branch to these movements, and it's sort of been a forced thing. Like, I don't think they wanted to, but I think that this movement has sort of forced them into a discussion about race in a way that they wouldn't have.
Yeah, but they're also, you have to remember the flaws of the movement. They're pretty much going after cops. Do they ever really talk about black on black violence? What do you think's a bigger problem for African Americans? Police killing them, or police killing African Americans, or other African Americans killing other?
I think that
That's an interesting point.
I think I do understand that there is a lot of black on black violence, but I think that the idea is that, so you have black on black violence, but the idea is that the police are supposed to be there to like help. So when people have black on black violence and then they have police on black violence,
right,
that might make them feel worse. Like the police is supposed to like, they're supposed to help you, but now you're sort of friend has turned in, is sort of portrayed as an enemy to many of people in lower income black communities.
Yeah, but the thing is that sometimes they push false narratives. Like look at Ferguson. Remember the hands up, don't shoot thing? That has proved totally false. And still they used it, and I don't think they ever apologized for using that. Because it was a totally false narrative, the hands up, don't shoot thing. That never happened. In reality, he charged a police officer. He actually attacked him. The police officer was injured. There's some scruffs inside his car. Then he ran back. Then he tried to go after him again. Okay.
Well, I'm not gonna defend the tactics of the Black Lives Matter movement.
And also, you have to remember that police violence like this, there are some cases, like I think, remember that case in South Carolina, that was caught on video? Like that, the guy who's at a traffic stop, that's tragic, okay? Well, and I think we can all say that is terrible, okay? But I don't think there's any use to go after police that are doing their jobs.
I don't either, but I think that one of the most important messages to take away from this is that when people are unsatisfied with the way things are going in the country, the reaction in the lower classes is to blame people of other races in the same class as them. That's a problem that goes back to the Revolutionary War and before that, when whites were dissatisfied with the way things were going and they targeted other people of other races. And I think that's what the elites want. They want people going after themselves instead of going after them, who are actually causing their problems, who are actually making them poor. You look at Donald Trump. He's attracting many blue-collar voters who have been sort of left behind by the globalized economy and all that. But Donald Trump is sort of saying, look, it's the immigrants' fault, or it's the blacks' fault. He's not saying that.
Did you ever say anything was the blacks' fault?
Okay, well he's saying that it's the immigrants' fault, and I think that is an important distinction. He's not saying it's the elite's fault. It's the people who signed these trade agreements. It's the people who these are the people that put you out of work. It's the CEOs who are moving their businesses or their manufacturing plants to other countries, and I think that's an important message, that whenever people are dissatisfied in the United States, the reaction from the lower classes is always to go after the other races in the lower class instead of going after the elites who are actually responsible for their unhappiness.
Oh yeah, so speaking of that, I like to apply this to Black Lives Matters movement. It seems that a lot of people are going after the police because they see these things, and some of these there is a reason to get angry behind them, but most of them, they're false, like the Ferguson case. But in reality, I think the real problem is that we have really incompetent leadership in some of these cities. We have no charter schools so that people can't get out of these terrible schools. It's true. Look at Baltimore. Look at where a bunch of these rioters came from in Baltimore.
We're not debating charter schools.
They came from schools. Hey, you got to Donald Trump rallies. I can get into Baltimore.
Right.
Baltimore is mentioned in the question, okay?
No.
So I think what we should really go after is, instead of police officers, should go after stuff that, I'm fine with body cameras. I'm fine with things that can prevent any of these terrible events from happening. But we should go after politicians who are really pushing bad policies. We should go after unions so that we can have charter schools. We should go after black-on-black crime, okay?
I'm not going to debate charter schools with you right now.
No, you were talking about Donald Trump rallies.
I know, but Donald Trump has been pushing a race narrative.
But what was in the question? How important is the Black Lives Matters movement? Do you think their taxes, particularly in Ferguson, Baltimore, has been effective? Nothing about Donald Trump. There's something about Baltimore. And charter schools, that is directly referencing Baltimore.
Well, charter schools are not, the lack of charter schools is not the reason why.
Oh, it's a big
people are
problem.
poor.
A lot of these kids that were riding Baltimore came out from the school. They're skipping
All right,
school.
We're getting a little
So
off
if-
topic. We're gonna move on to the next question.
Actually, yeah, let me.
If we want to get back on track
Yeah,
here,
you're right.
All right, go ahead.
I think that obviously I don't condone the rioting. I think that that sort of is the opposite of what they should be doing. They're sort of destroying their own community instead of coming together like they should
Yeah.
be. But I do think that one of the big trends that came with the Black Lives Matter movement was like how they all got like people always recorded things on their phones. So
That's an
this
interesting
was like
point, yeah.
they always, at least in most of the cases, of course there were some cases where it was false, which is unfortunate, but in most of the cases people were videotaping the police brutality, and they were able to display it to the world on the internet. The people who were part of that movement did a very good job of sort of raising awareness for the police brutality. I remember like there was a time, like it sort of died down a little bit now, but like back a few months ago, there was a time where like every single day on the news you'd hear like police brutality. It was all over.
But not all of it was actually police brutality, though. Like in
Well, that's
Yeah.
a different issue. You're saying like they sort of popularized
it was like
the handheld recording of
Yeah,
that,
like-
and that's never really
like in
happened
like
before.
for like
yeah,
the
recording's good, I think.
like the parachuting, like we hear about that every day. Like everyone changed their Facebook profile pictures. It was a huge thing. It was a similar case here. Everyone was talking about police brutality. I even had like some friends on Facebook who had put Black Lives Matter as their cover photo. Like it was, I think they did do a good job at really raising awareness, which I think was something that they did well.
Okay. You mentioned recording these incidences with cell phones, but do you think that police officers should be required to wear body cameras so as to eliminate some of the ambiguity surrounding police brutality?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty straightforward question, but I really don't see any drawbacks to it. Like maybe, let's say this doesn't work out as well as intended. There really is no drawback aside from some slight maybe privacy issues, but I think that they should. It would in court we wouldn't have to rely on like the police officer's memory of what happened. We would have hard video evidence of what was going on, and
I
then
don't think there's anything wrong with that.
there
Well,
would.
Well, yeah, I agree with you guys. I think body cameras for police officers are a great idea. And I actually think in a lot of cases they'd actually help the police officer. Though there definitely are cases where it'd go against the police officer. But either way, it'd be good because it's actually happened. Right. So there is one drawback. I support body cameras. The only possible drawback is price. Though there is competition in this sort of industry. So I think that's sort of driving the price down. So I think that it'd be nice to have body cameras on police, and I think that body cameras on cars has helped in a lot of cases. So
yeah, you mean the dashboard camera?
Yeah, dashboard camera. Yeah.
yeah.
So I think if those help. I think it'd probably be even better if you had police officers wear body cameras. I think it'd be fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with all that.
I just think it'd be fine.
All right.
Is this something we all agreed on, pretty much?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's good.
Amazing.
Amazing.
That's a first. All right, we're going to move on to the next question. How has media coverage of terrorist attacks in Western countries been different from terrorism coverage in other countries, specifically those in the Middle East? Does this have anything to do with race?
I don't know if it has anything to do with race, but I definitely think there's a problem here. When we have, in the year 2016, there have been, dozens of terrorist attacks, some killing more people than the Belgium terrorist attacks recently. For example, in Nigeria, the Boko Haram attacked a village and killed 65 people. Didn't hear about it. No one in the West sort of cared enough to put that in it might have made like a back page story in the New York Times, but I think that there's a definite problem here with Western terrorist attacks that happen in Western countries just aren't getting they're getting more press coverage than terrorist attacks happening in other countries, and we're all about in the West equality and all that, but this doesn't seem right.
Well,
yeah, I definitely agree that there is a problem with equality of coverage. I think one of the reasons that happens is, I think there are a few reasons. One, Western countries, they are big countries and many people know about them. So possibly because, for example, in Paris, like you ask anyone in this school, that they know what Paris is, and there probably been a lot of people who have gone to Paris. It's sort of like a cultural powerhouse down there, so a lot of people might feel more connected to it. It is also one of the big reasons is unusual target. Like down in the Middle East, it's very unstable, so there's probably a lot of, there's so much action going down there that they might feel like, oh, there's been another bombing, another shooting. But so there are a lot of those, so it's like a lot of saturation of violence. But up in Paris, for example, there's like, that rarely happens.
Right.
So one small thing happens in Paris and like, it's
But,
like,
you know,
wow, that's never
I
happened.
think
But I still do agree that there should be equality,
Well,
that we need to sort of try to overlook
I
that
think
bias.
you brought up some good points. One, like you say that it's a lot more common in the Middle East, and that's because it's a lot more common. But there's also a couple points I'd like to bring up. One, I think people in the Western world care more about what happens in the Western world because they live in the Western world. Okay, I think it makes sense to care more about the area you live in and what happens there. And also, I'd say a terrorist attack in Paris or Belgium is a lot more shocking than a terrorist attack in Middle East or Africa or something like that, because Paris and Belgium, countries like that, are generally seen as much more safe than those countries. They're generally seen as much more stable. They're a lot less violent. So a lot of this has to do with like how well ISIS could infiltrate secure countries. And also, these are countries we have a lot more connections with countries in the Middle East. So I'd like to point that out. And also, I'd actually be interested in how countries in the Middle East report terrorist attacks, like how they report on Western terrorist attacks, how they report on Eastern
that's
terrorist
interesting.
attacks.
I would like to say that in the West, especially in the United States, we pride ourselves on diversity. So to say that, you know, people in the United States might not have as much of a connection with people in Nigeria or people in the Middle East than with people with France is true to some extent, because the United States shares values with France and shares a form of government with France. However, we do not share the same demographics, meaning that there are more people in the United States, more minorities who might care about terrorist attacks happening in third world countries.
Well, I don't think just because they're a minority they do care about what's happening in third world
Well, no,
countries.
but
I
if
think
you
they
were
care about
from-
what's happening in this country.
Right. No, I know. Well, you know, but if your family's Middle Eastern and you move to the United States, you're probably going to want to know about a terrorist attack that happened in your home country.
Yeah.
Or not your home country, but the country of your origin.
Yeah, definitely if you have some sort of a connection to it. Like, even if you don't have family living there, if you have some sort of a like traditional connection,
And so that's a problem that we're not seeing adequate reporting on that.
Well, like I said, it's a lot more surprising to have violence in Europe and the United States. Okay, there's a lot more violence in the Middle East.
But I think
I think most people.
I think part of the
would be
reason
more
why
interested
there's more
in
violence in the
Western
Middle East is because we don't have adequate coverage of it.
Well,
People don't know what's
What are
happening.
we supposed to do about it? Like we're not gonna put up the New York PD in Istanbul or and we're not gonna put it in Iraq. The thing is that they have to care for themselves.
Well, but I think that there's been no analysis of why those places are like that because there's been no coverage of it. And when you look at why those places are like that, why Iraq is such a mess, why Syria is such a mess, a lot of it has to do with Western intervention over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st century.
It's pretty
right from the
violent
end of
without-
World War I, the Allied powers got together and divided up the Middle East with artificial borders that beared nothing on ethnic considerations or tribal considerations. And so I think that's part of the reason why there's a lot of turmoil in the Middle East, just simply because the borders are artificial. They weren't created by the people who lived there. Second of all, throughout the 20th century, Western powers have intervened in the Middle East. You take a look at Operation Ajax, which was an operation carried out by the U.S. and the U.K. and Iran to overthrow a democratically elected government, because they nationalized their oil industry, which we wanted access to.
It's also kind of about the spread of communism, and they're kind of worried about it.
That's what they said.
I won't necessarily say is worth. I'm against this interventionist policy.
No, I know, but hang on. Let me say my point. My point is that there's been no analysis in the media about why these places are so violent in the Middle East.
Well,
And I think part of that is because there's no coverage. There's no coverage of it. So we can't go to the roots of the problem and say, you know, we need to change how we act in the Middle East because there's no coverage of violence in the Middle East. Or there is coverage, but it's very minimal compared to the coverage we get when there's a bombing in Belgium or in France or in, you know, the U.S. there's a terrorist attack.
well, the thing that we're talking about the news. So like what we just talked about, it's definitely good to look at that as a historical development. And I think that pretty much, like well over a
what I'm saying
majority
is
of
that
people in
because
the
the
U.S.
news doesn't-
oppose the Iraq War, so I think they're kind of
Yeah.
aware of some of this stuff, even if it's very vague. I don't really know how many Americans even know the Iraq War. I don't even know, but I just think.
No,
but
I think
still,
you're right.
So I would say that that's important as historical developments, but we're talking about the news, okay? And kind of like what do people care about more? Terrorist attack in the United States or the Western world? You have to think about what's more common, terrorist
No, I
attacks
know.
in the United States or
I
the
know.
Western world?
I agree with you. But what I'm saying is that there's been no analysis of how our actions in the Middle East has affected the level of violence in the Middle East, and that's a problem, and that's something that the media contributes to by sort of whitewashing what we do. So there you go.
I definitely think that if we were to cover this on the news, it would sort of like Paris attacks, sort of like once these mass shootings or bombings are covered on the news, like that's sometimes the first time some people hear of it. They don't hear it from other sources, and once more people hear about it, it sort of creates a snowball effect. So if for example, maybe a few hundred people realize, wow, our intervention in the Middle East is a big problem, another 100 people will see it, and then they'll want to join, and then soon you could have the whole country in another Black Lives Matter-esque sort of, I guess,
I know
something like
saying.
that,
Well,
except in this case it would be for us intervening in the
And I think
Middle
we need
East,
that because
I've-
even in liberal camps, so like Hillary Clinton, no one is seriously advocating for a non-interventionist foreign policy.
Well, it kind of just depends on what you're looking for. There are Ted Cruz is kind of a non-interventionist too.
Yeah, what do you mean? Ted
Yeah,
Cruz
Libya.
is
no. There's a debate where Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz got.
well, that's
over
what
the
my
fu-
point was. In Libya, that's an example of liberals
Yeah.
supporting intervention.
But
The Obama
I think the
administration and
people
Hillary
doing,
Clinton
I think the
supporting.
people doing this know very well what has happened in the past. Okay, and also the Obama administration. There's a news report that Obama went into Libya, I believe, despite what other people told him to do.
No, it was actually the other way around. Obama was really reluctant to go into Libya.
No, I know.
Hillary
no, he
Clinton and
wanted to go
John
into
Kerry
Libya.
are
He
far
wanted
more.
Libya. He wanted to go to Libya. I think a lot of his decisions been made in despite of what other people close to him have told him to do. Like
So
people
there
are
was
experiencing these sort of things.
an article in The Atlantic called The Obama Doctrine, which was basically a long-form interview with Obama. It was like 40 pages long or something. And in that, Obama, basically said, or he didn't say this, but it was implied that Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, who are much more hawkish than he is, and have been pushing they pushed intervention in Libya, and they were pushing for intervention in Syria. And Obama sort of looked at what happened in Libya. It was a big failure.
I think there's other aides pushing against intervention.
Yeah, to some degree, but what I'm saying is that on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans both have historically supported intervention in these countries.
But also,
And so there's been no real alternative to that. And I think a part of that is the media has been overly sympathetic to these interventions. They've been sort of overly biased towards them.
Well, I think a lot of people are against these interventions in the media, especially the liberal media. And also,
liberal media is just
also
a big
I'd like to
part
say,
of
if
it.
you want to
Yeah.
know about intervention and stuff like that, you're going to get to know about it. Things that we're talking about the news, what actually interests people, will get people to watch it. Okay? So also, and people are generally more interested in terrorist attacks in the Western world. So that's something to point out. And also, there are plenty of celebrities. Look at our celebrities. Like some of them say, I don't know, Bush created ISIS. There's this guy, I think, what was his name? He's the guy who went in to get an interview with El Chapo rather. He's on Conan, and he said Bush created ISIS.
Well,
so there's plenty of
there's
people who
significant
see,
evidence
Bush
for
did not
that,
create
but-
ISIS. Okay, don't even go there.
Well,
No.
don't go there. Well, what I'm saying is that the media has been, even the liberal media, the New York Times, they've been complacent in an interventionist foreign policy, and they've been supportive of that.
Look, it's fine for them to have a different opinion, though.
But they haven't had a different opinion. They've sort of they've supported this, even though there's been clear evidence, not clear, even though some of the actions that the U.S. were committing were malicious in nature and like blatantly imperialistic.
Well, yeah.
And they sort of frame it, oh, it's a battle against communism. Oh, you
well,
know.
that's because it was that's because that's what they were trying to do. I think that they actually believed back in the days of the Cold War is that they were actually trying to topple communist governments. Like the governments they toppled, they had more socialist leanings and stuff like that.
But lots of those governments were democratically elected.
It's good to argue it's a mistake. Yeah,
So.
It's easy to argue that's a mistake. But the thing is that the democratically elected governments are communist
Left-leaning.
left communist leaning. Yeah, so left leaning is kind of communist. And this is a time where the United States was in a global conflict with the USSR over what ideology would be supreme: capitalism, freedom, or communism. So
Well,
you have to think about it. I would say it's a mistake.
It's sort of ironic.
It is a mistake, I'd say, the intervention in the South American countries. I think if they're elected a leader, you ought to just let it be in those cases. So I would agree with you, and it's a mistake. But I think they really did. I think they really did believe that it was to stop communism, even if it didn't really.
Well, it's
do
sort of
much,
ironic that
stabilize the
we can
region.
say that capitalism is about freedom and democracy, while various governments in the Middle East, in Iran, and in Latin America, we overthrew that were democratically elected, and we overthrew them because they were left-leaning. So it's ironic to say it's.
Well, what do you rather? What do you think is
It's
more
ridiculous
free?
to say.
Well, America or
I'm not
let's
saying
see.
that.
Look at Cuba. Look at USSR. Look at China.
But those governments
North
weren't
Korea.
Cuba. They weren't the USSR. They were democratically elected. They had granted socialist leanings, but that doesn't mean that they were anti-freedom or anti-democracy.
Well, the thing is that, I would agree with you. I'd say that they shouldn't have toppled those governments, but they were scared that they could become under major Soviet influence. Because that's what the Soviet Union was trying to do.
Last point. You can go ahead.
Well, okay, so first of all, the Cold War was sort of a front for U.S. imperialism. We could go into any country we wanted that had just elected a left-leaning government and overthrow it, even if that government was democratically elected, in a free process, in a democratic process,
I would say that's
something
a
that
mistake.
we espouse, and we could go into that government and overthrow it and install a right-wing dictator. And so that's what the Cold War was about for us. It was about expanding U.S.
But
influence.
you have to think why. It's bad they did it. Like if Charlie knocked over the vase.
But they didn't. What I'm saying is they didn't do it to fight communism. They did it because we wanted influence in those countries.
Communism.
In fact, in Guatemala,
And they want influence too, but some of it did have to do with
the
communism.
United Fruit Company in Guatemala, which was an American company that employed, thousands of Guatemalans in brutal conditions, and at some point in the 50s, the Guatemalan government changed, and a socialist was put in office with a democratic. It was a democratic process. He was elected, and we went in, and because the United Fruit Company was sort of being thrown off the backs of these people, we went in and we overthrew the government.
Yeah, and I'd say that's a mistake.
Okay.
That concludes our roundtable discussion on race and religion in the United States.